Hi, everyone. This is Federalist 59. And according to the email that I sent out, we will have a Federalist paper video every week through July into August. The 4th of July is the first Thursday in July. So we won't be able to meet June or July without setting a different date. And it's getting way too complicated to keep on trying to do that. So what I'm going to do is, like I said, a Federalist paper video every week till we get to August. And then in August, I'll contact everybody and see if they want to meet in real life in the usual meeting place. So for now, we have Federalist 59 to do. And I'm going to keep these videos at about 15 minutes because YouTube won't let me load anything up that's any bigger directly like this. So anyway, I got to keep it simple, and I think we'll make a lot of headway doing it this way. So here we go. Federalist 59 is Alexander Hamilton taking over for James Madison. The Federalist Papers 52 through 58 have been written by James Madison, and they cover all of the objections to the House of Representatives according to the different articles in the Constitution. So here we go. Here is the beginning of Federalist 59. Hamilton begins. The natural order of the subject leads us to consider in this place that provision of the Constitution which authorizes the national legislature to regulate, in the last resort, the election of its own members. Okay, so naturally, he's progressing through all of the objections. Keep in mind, all of these things were written under the pseudonym Publius, but he's going through all of the objections to the House of Representatives, and Hamilton is going to quote from, it's Article 1, Section 4, Paragraph 1 of the Constitution, and it goes as follows. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in such state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. So this is the quote from the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton writes it into this Federalist paper. And he says, this provision has not only been declaimed against by those who condemn the Constitution in the gross, but it has been censured by those who have objected with less latitude and greater moderation. And in one instance, it has been thought exceptionable by a gentleman who has declared himself the advocate of every other part of the system. So, what is going on here? I think these gentlemen have a point. So, Alexander Hamilton begins. I am greatly mistaken, notwithstanding, if there be any article in the whole plan more conveniently defensible than this. Its propriety rests upon the evidence of this plain proposition, that every government ought to contain in itself the means of its own preservation. Okay, this is basically a maxim that Alexander Hamilton is going to use to justify this part of the Constitution. And this maxim was derived by all of the framers' experiences with modern day governments, and then looking back in history at the Republic of Rome, the different confederacies in Greece. They were examining history very closely to figure out, what are the patterns? What are the maxims that we can learn? What are the inevitable pitfalls? If you do this, if you leave that open, if you give this opportunity, how will it destroy a government? And this is one of those. Every government ought to contain in itself the means of its own preservation. Boom. So, he says that a departure from so fundamental a principle is a portion of imperfection in the system, the Constitution system, which may prove the seed of future weakness and perhaps anarchy. So In the third paragraph, Hamilton says they weren't able to create an election law for the Constitution that would cover every aspect of elections for all time, everywhere. But he tells us a discretionary power over elections ought to exist somewhere. Remember that axiom, right? So he puts it this way. The power must either have been lodged wholly in the national legislature or wholly in the state legislature, or primarily in the latter and ultimately in the former. The last mode has, with reason, been preferred by the convention. They have submitted, hold on just a second, I'm trying to figure out where my little timer is on this thing. Okay, here we go. They have submitted the regulation of elections for the federal government in the first instance to the local administrations, which in ordinary cases, and when no improper views prevail, may be both more convenient and more satisfactory. But they have reserved to the national authority a right to interpose whenever extraordinary circumstances might render that interposition necessary to its safety. There you go. This is not a power that's going to be exerted capriciously, and it's going to actually take a law to for the federal government to be allowed to use this power. So, the House of Representatives is going to be on this legislation. The Senate, which at this point was still being appointed by state legislatures, different senators for the states were being appointed by the state legislatures. And then a president was going to be in on this too. So it was not capricious and it was not without representation. So Hamilton goes on and says, nothing can be more evident than that an exclusive power of regulating elections for the national government in the hands of the state legislatures would leave the existence of the Union entirely at their mercy. They could at any moment annihilate it by neglecting to provide for the choice of persons to administer its affairs. It is to little purpose to say that a neglect or omission of this kind would not be likely to take place. The constitutional possibility of the thing without an equivalent for the risk is an unanswerable objection. And he says, if we are in a humor to presume abuses of power, it is as fair to presume them on the part of the state governments as on the part of the general government, as it is more consonant to the rules of a just theory to trust the Union with the care of its own existence than to transfer that care to any other hands. If abuses of power are to be hazarded on the one side or the other, it is more rational to hazard them where the power would naturally be placed than where it would unnaturally be placed. So the power to preserve the government should rest within that government, okay? Now, Hamilton is going to give us one of his famous suppositions, his famous four examples, all right? Suppose an article had been introduced into the Constitution empowering the United States to regulate the elections for the particular states. Would any man have hesitated to condemn it, both as an unwarrantable transposition of power and as a premeditated engine for the destruction of the state governments? Right? So the converse should not be true, all right? So it says like this. The violation of principle in this case would have required no comment, and to an unbiased observer, it will not be less apparent in the project of subjecting the existence of the national government in a similar respect to the pleasure of the state governments, right? That's sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander, or is it the other way around maybe? I can't remember. An impartial view of the matter cannot fail to result in a conviction that each, as far as possible, ought to depend on itself for preservation, right? So he talks about an objection to this position and says that the constitution of the National Senate would involve, in its full extent, the danger which is suggested might flow from an exclusive power in the state legislatures to regulate the federal elections, right? Like the states are appointing their senators. Why is this allowed to continue to happen? So he says this argument does seem on its face to make sense, but it really doesn't, because they, on the one hand, are going to have the ability, but if they do that, they're going to run up against this other problem that he gets into in the next paragraph. And he explains how the construction of the Senate is actually one of the ways that prevents this abuse of power. The senators are to be chosen for a period of 6 years. There is to be a rotation by which the seats of a third part of them are to be vacated and replenished every 2 years, and no state is to be entitled to more than 2 senators. A quorum of the body is to consist of 16 members. So if you were to look at, and he gets into this, if you were to look at a temporary faction of senators or of state legislatures who got together and foiled the plans of the election process to send senators to the Congress and kind of mess things up. Well, the way that it's set up would just mean that they were cut out of representation, which that probably wouldn't happen. So he thinks that a temporary one would end up on the small scale, and it wouldn't be able to disrupt business. A long-lasting one would involve many key people in the legislatures, and it would be difficult to do because they would be so cut out of legislation on the long term, unless they all did it at the same time. But if it was a long-term, widespread, states not sending people to the Senate, it would be a fixed and rooted disaffection in the great body of the people, which will either never exist at all or will in all probability proceed from an experience of the inaptitude of the general government to the advancement of their happiness, in which event no good citizen could desire its continuance. Okay, now, however, with the House of Representatives, a general election occurs once every 2 years. And if a few large states got together and were like, we're not sending people, they would completely disrupt the business of the House. The Congress was wide open on that end to disruption. So Hamilton just basically says we had to allow the states to have their representation. The Senate is essential to represent the state legislatures and the state's interest. We left ourselves open to too much on the House of Representatives side because of the numbers and the frequency. We've made some inbuilt safe gaps with the rotation and frequency of the Senate. And then we've left this little power to help us regulate those elections on the House side. So, but then he goes into the abuses of power from people within the states. And we get into that subject of faction and how faction can just totally derail and disrupt a republic. He also gets into how foreign powers and influence will completely disrupt a republic. And so the national government has to have the ability to preserve itself through those elections, because the election cycle is so crucial and free and fair and correct and I don't know how you call it, righteous, upright elections are essential for the health of a republic. So I hope Hamilton is convincing you of the correctness of this clause of the Constitution. Like I said, I will make a video a week on the next papers. When we get into the Senate, we will progress quickly into impeachment, which should be pretty good for us to know about since there's so much of that in the news right now. So anyway, I hope you're all having a wonderful summer. I look forward to seeing everybody at the other meetings that we all attend in the very near future. Until we meet again in real life, have a great week.